Hello and welcome to part 2 of week 5 in business ethics. Today we're covering chapter 4 in our textbook, 3 special stakeholders, society, the environment, and government. We're still in part 1 where we're talking about the intersections between society and business. Gone a little bit slowly here for the first couple of slides, so maybe we'll try to move a little bit quicker. We've just talked about how the concept of shareholder primacy has changed over the years from legal precedent saying it's the only and most important factor in deciding how to run a business, increasing profits for shareholders, all the way up to 1968, where society is changing and we recognize that sometimes it's more profitable to think about something other than immediate profit, and instead thinking about long-term interaction with the community that surrounds whichever business it is that we're talking about. Some see a downside when it comes to corporate latitude in deciding the goals and direction of the firm. There was a recent Hobby Lobby case in which, if you're not familiar with Hobby Lobby, they're not really in the city that much. It's sort of like a Michael's, in which you can go in and it's a big department store for arts and crafts. Well, they didn't want to pay for birth control for their female employees, and they took it to the courts saying that this was their personal, religious, moral conviction, and they should be able to decide the direction of their company because it suits their values and the values of the communities that they live in. And they won. They were given the berth from the courts to say that this corporation can be interpreted as a person, and as a person, the values that they hold can at least partially determine the direction of policy for their company. And our textbook has mentioned corporate personhood a couple of times, and we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive outside of the textbook into corporate personhood in next week. Like I've mentioned before, sometimes we're going to have supplemental materials. I'm going to look for short supplemental materials since the textbook chapters do tend to be quite long. But if I can't shorten it, I will make available the philosophical resource, which might be 20 pages long, not expecting you to read it all, and I'll give you a summary of the important points. That'll just be a page or two. So philosophers and business people have debated on the merits and detriments of considering an incorporated company to be sort of like a person, having some of the same rights as an individual citizen would have. And it's an interesting topic to think about. But when going back to the Hobby Lobby case, you might see now how giving latitude to managers, CEOs, and boards of directors to think about things other than just the bottom line in the short term might lead us to all of these murky ethical debates. One thing I don't think that the book points out, which is different between the Wrigley case and the Hobby Lobby case, is one focuses on community values, debating with many people's input what's best for the community, what's best for the business, and what's best for both of them as an entity. Whereas in the Hobby Lobby case, it's just single personal values. It's not a debate, a wider democratic or pseudo-democratic debate, thinking about what the best long-term plan is for the company and the community. It's closer to an individual deciding what they think is right and what's wrong. And I think that that's a pretty big distinction. Because if we ultimately think that one of the roles of business is to fit in to the community around them and work toward making the community a better place, it's never going to be one person's voice who decides what's right and wrong. It'll be an ongoing debate. It'll be an ongoing process of improvement. And I think that the book could have noticed that. The next section we get is called The Two Sides of the Corporate Responsibility Debate. Now, corporate social responsibility as an ethical doctrine has its roots in the mid-20th century, so like the 30s, 40s, and 50s of last century. And at first it was met with mockery and then has slowly been adopted over time to the point where we now think that there is a moral minimum that businesses, I should say many corporations and companies believe that there is a moral minimum that a company must undertake in order to, as the book says, satisfy the base threshold for acting ethically. Going back to people like Milton Friedman, who are absolute free market advocates, they say this isn't the role of business. The role of business is to make profit however they can, and then maybe other entities in the world, like government, should provide the checks and balances. Individuals that make up a company are the ones that should be able to decide whether or not to donate their time and money to social issues. Another thing that the book doesn't go into as a philosophical issue are societal tendencies toward communality and societal tendencies toward individuality. In classes you may have taken in the past, either in college or in high school, you may have heard of the phrase rugged individualism, meaning you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You should be free to do whatever you want to do, again, unless you're hurting somebody else. And we should have as small of a government as possible. That's one viewpoint. And it focuses on freedom, individual freedoms, almost to the exclusion of general social welfare, which is sort of the other side of the dichotomy, the either or. Because a lot of times when you try and protect equality, or you try and protect resources that are available to everyone, opportunities that are available to everyone, you must, in some sense, reduce individual freedom, right? Because you can say, think about the most extreme case of inequality. If there were only $1,000 in a particular economy, and one person had 999 of those dollars, and the rest of the community had to split $1, that person that is rich can decide pretty much everything. How schools are going to be, or how they don't want to donate to schools. They can either build roads or not. They have the absolute freedom to do whatever they want with that wealth, whereas those other 999 people have almost no freedom at all. So we might pass a law or a rule that says no one is allowed to have 99% of the wealth. That you can be wealthy, but there's a cap. And there must be some percentage of the economy that is spent on general welfare. That automatically reduces the freedom of that one person. But we're thinking about the group as well as the individual. And the history of politics and the history of social thought has been riddled with this question of how we balance the common good with individual rights and freedom. And this book could have talked about that a little bit more. Another definition we get is fiduciary duty, a high level of legal responsibility owed by those who manage someone else's money, which include the duties of care and loyalty. So this is another aspect to shareholder primacy. When people give you their money, when people invest in your company, you have to be loyal to them. You have to be loyal to their interests. But the nitty-gritty is always coming down saying, well, what are the best interests? The short term, the long term, the profit motive, or the bigger picture? And then we get cases from the real world, which this slide is talking about. I hesitate to say page numbers because I look at the PDF, which is numbered a particular way, and I have a print copy, which is numbered a particular way, and most of you looking at the online version of the textbook, there aren't even numbers. So I generally like to say the section of the textbook when I'm talking about it instead of the page number. So here we talk about the Shakti program. So if you've never heard of Unilever, I'd be surprised. They own a very wide variety of products throughout the world. And they implemented this program to both increase their own profitability and corporate reach, but also to try and commit to this moral minimum, in which they tried to give the money to rural Shakti women in India to start their own mini businesses in which they had Unilever products and could sell them to their local communities. They also educated them in how to negotiate and how to manage their money, give them the business basics, and this has been a great success for Unilever, so much so that they also expanded it to men and young women generally. Now whole families are participating in this business where the men go out and they can deliver via vehicle the products that the women were only walking around the neighborhood. And one way to analyze this case study is to follow these questions. Do you think Unilever has mixed motives? And if so, does that discredit the program? So they're asking you, well, does Unilever also want to make money out of this deal? And if they do, hint, they probably do, does that discredit their social goals as well? And what do you think? Do you think this model could be duplicated elsewhere in other areas of the world and with other types of products? Those are good questions to think about on your own or maybe within the homework. Then our book tries to talk about how companies that implement corporate social responsibility policies, well, they can make a profit too. So the ones in green are social index funds that have committed to creating programs within their businesses that are responsible to social issues, whereas, of course, the ones in pink are just the standard S&P and NASDAQ. And if you look at the profitability in the year-to-date, 2-year return, 5-year return, they're very comparable. So the standard party line is you still can be profitable even in being socially responsible. But of course, people still are in a debate about that. So this has been section 1, where we think about business and how it fits into society, what is owed to our shareholders versus what is owed to the wider community. Now, in the second part, we're going to talk about the same thing with the second special stakeholder, the environment, in which the textbook wants you to know about Earth jurisprudence, evaluate the claim that sustainability benefits both business and the environment, and identify and describe initiatives that attempt to regulate pollution or encourage businesses to adopt clean energy sources. Okay, so when we think about the word sustainability, which is very much in the public domain right about now, we can think of the sustainability of smaller entities like our business. How do we keep our business going? How do we make sure it is successful throughout the years? We can also talk about sustainability in another way, in a larger way, in our connection with the environment. In the past, people have thought of natural resources as being unlimited. No matter what they did, there would still be more raw materials to make goods and services with. But in recent decades, we have figured out that that is not really the case, that the methods with which we use to create our economy, they matter. They can degrade the environment in such a way that we won't have that resource any longer. So how do we figure out the balance point, again, between profit and corporate responsibility and fiduciary duty and the long-term view of how the environment around us is affected? There's a lot of bad stuff that happens. We all know it. We hear about it all the time. One of the examples in the book were how the big cruise ships dump human waste, raw sewage, oftentimes near coastlines at night, and that ends up killing tons of animal life in the sea and plant life, and making people sick. There have been cases, and I didn't look this up, I wanted to though, right above this picture in our textbook, 1.5 paragraphs, it says, for example, in a recently revealed report, companies all over the world have for years been secretly burning toxic materials like carbon dioxide at night. I need to look at that report. I'm very curious as to which companies that was, because this is the cynic that's probably in all of us. We're talking about ethics, but there'll always be somebody who just doesn't care and does whatever is cheaper and faster and less painful. And while that might be true, it doesn't really mean that the people who are working genuinely toward improving things aren't improving things. One way to look at it, I think, when I get at my most cynical, is that every good thing you do actually puts good into the world, no matter that there are other bad things happening at the same time. So there's no real excuse to just throw your hands up in the air and say nothing will ever be good ever, because you can actually affect some change, however small, with the choices that you make. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse there. Okay. What is Earth jurisprudence? So we know that corporations have been considered pseudo entities, pseudo human beings that have some kind of rights that are also accorded to individual citizens, the corporation as a person. So why can't we do that with the environment? Why can't we say that particular sections of the environment, or even the environment as a whole, should have some of the rights of a person? Because otherwise it can't stand up for itself, and the long-term future of our world gets disregarded completely. This chapter, or this section of the chapter, mentions Cormac Cullinan, who is an environmental attorney, author, and leading proponent of Earth jurisprudence, who posits that to consider Earth justice, we should commit ourselves to these tenets that are reproduced in our textbook. He says, the Earth and all living things that constitute it, that are within it, have fundamental rights, including the right to exist, to have a habitat, or a place to be. This is the important part, I think. Humans must adapt their legal, political, economic, and social systems to be consistent with the fundamental laws or principles that govern how the universe functions. So just keep that in mind for a second. Human acts, including businesses that infringe on the fundamental rights of other living things, violate fundamental principles and are therefore illegitimate and unlawful. So that's kind of crazy. It seems really basic. We have to respect how the universe functions. And I know there's debate about climate change, but when we have a consensus of scientists and data that show us that what we're doing is having adverse effects, that means the actual physical world governed by the laws of physics and chemistry is telling us that we need to behave a different way if we want to hold on to the resources of the world in the future of humanity for our kids and our kids' kids. I found this section of the textbook a little condescending. Sustainability can create long-term cost savings for companies. That's true. Sustainability can be very good for business, developing new technologies and new systems and new jobs, not to mention mitigating all of the crap you're going to have to pay for later when you have to fix all the pollution that you dumped into the world. Again, we're hitting on 20 minutes, so I am going to end part 2, and I will see you in part 3 to wrap up the second section of the chapter and move on to the third and final part of the chapter.